Under the cruel blaze of the western sun, dust shimmered above the square, like a veil hiding secrets no one dared name. The ground was trampled into hard earth, the air sharp with the smell of leather, sweat, and something harsher, the hunger of a crowd eager to witness humiliation. Men leaned against the posts outside the saloon, their voices carrying rough laughter, each insult thrown like stones toward the chained figure in the center. Women clutched their children tighter, skirts brushing against their ankles as they whispered warnings about what would happen to anyone foolish enough to cross the law of Dry Creek. Yet no one could look away, for the man standing in irons drew their gaze as surely as the mountains drew the horizon. He was taller than most, broad in the shoulders, his hair falling past his face in black waves that caught the sunlight like dark fire. His wrists bore grooves cut deep by rusted shackles, and still he stood with a dignity that unsettled those who called him savage. In his silence, in the steady calm of his dark eyes, there was an unspoken defiance, as if he refused to surrender the last fragment of his humanity to the jeers of the crowd. The sheriff strutted about him with a showman's ease, his badge flashing gold as he called out the terms of the sale. The words, $50 to start, rang out like a sentence, as though a man's worth could be measured in coins. The voices rose with cruel delight, beast, thief, brute, but the prisoner never flinched. Instead, he scanned their faces, and the silence that burned between his gaze and theirs said more than any outburst ever could. It was then that a voice, sharp as thunder breaking a summer sky, cut across the noise. "Don't hurt him!" Heads whipped toward the sound, and the crowd parted with surprise as a lone woman stepped forward. Her dress was plain brown, worn thin by years of hard labor and too many washings, yet she carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that no hardship could steal. Her auburn hair, braided back in severe order, only sharpened the fire in her green eyes. People whispered her name, Clara Whitford, the widow, the stubborn one who lived alone on the failing ranch just beyond town, too proud to sell, too proud to remarry, and far too stubborn to bend to pity. And now, here she was, walking into the fire of judgment with her head held high. "I'll buy him," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. For a moment the square froze. Even the wind stilled, as though the earth itself strained to hear her. The sheriff smirked, thinking to shame her, but Clara pulled a bundle of coins from her worn purse, holding it aloft. $70, all I have." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs of madness, warnings of ruin, and harsh condemnations rained down upon her, but she did not yield. She fixed her gaze upon the prisoner, her voice rising with conviction that wrapped around the moment like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "Call him savage if you must. I see a man worth saving." And for the first time, something flickered in the prisoner's eyes, something fragile, a buried ember of surprise, maybe even hope. What followed was not merely a transaction, but a clash of worlds. The sheriff grumbled, the townsfolk cursed her name, and the chains clattered to the ground. Yet Clara's steps did not falter as she led him away, walking through the sea of disapproval with the grace of someone carrying not only her own fate, but his as well. Behind them, voices hissed like rattlesnakes. "She'll regret it. She's inviting ruin. She'll never survive." And yet, beneath the weight of every stare, Clara felt something stronger than fear, Purpose, the kind of healing purpose that takes root in broken hearts when they dare to reach for more than survival. Her hand brushed the iron that still bound his wrists, and her words, low and warm, broke the silence between them. "Come with me." He obeyed, not as a man defeated, but as one choosing, perhaps for the first time in years, to walk towards something rather than away from it. The sun was sinking when they reached the edge of town, its golden light painting long shadows across the road. Clara could feel the burn of every whispered warning at her back, but she refused to turn. For 3 years she had carried loss like a stone in her chest, a widow keeping a dream alive on land that seemed to wither under her touch. But now, with each step beside this man the world called savage, she felt the strange stirring of possibility. Perhaps she had not only bought his freedom, but reclaimed a fragment of her own. If you're still here, listening to this journey unfold, let your heart linger a moment on Clara's defiance, on Samuel's quiet dignity, on the healing spark that can light even in the dustiest corners of despair. Sometimes the smallest act of courage is enough to change 2 lives, and perhaps your own. If these words soothe you, if they stir warmth where the world has left you cold, let me invite you gently, like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment with the part that touched you, so we may walk this road together, carrying not only stories, but the strength they bring. And as the dusty trail bent toward the horizon, Clara and the man she refused to abandon stepped forward into the unknown, 2 broken souls with the chance to heal. The chains around his wrists still rattled faintly, but the rhythm of their steps fell into quiet harmony as they left the square behind. Clara could feel the heavy weight of eyes burning against her back, voices murmuring like restless wind through the cottonwoods. Every whispered curse, every accusation of madness, followed her out of town. Yet beneath the storm of disapproval, she held her chin high, each stride steady, a fragile defiance holding her together. Beside her, Samuel walked with calm poise, the sun glinting across the sharp line of his jaw. For a man shackled and scorned, there was no trace of shame in his bearing. He carried the air of someone who had endured far worse than the cruelty of a crowd, someone who had survived storms fierce enough to strip any lesser soul bare. The road stretched toward the low hills, dry earth cracking under their boots. The silence between them was not empty. It pulsed with tension and quiet curiosity, as though both woman and man wondered what fate had tied them together. Clara's heart still beat fiercely from the moment she had lifted her coin purse, yet she refused to let the tremor of her hand betray the fear gnawing at her belly. She had spoken boldly, louder than her grief, stronger than her loneliness, but now, with every step farther from town, the reality of her choice pressed closer. She had brought a stranger into her life, a man most would call dangerous, untamable, unworthy. And yet, when she dared to glance sideways at him, all she saw was the quiet dignity of a soul who refused to be broken. The sheriff's voice echoed faintly in her memory, warnings of throats cut in the night, of danger stalking her own house. But when Clara let her eyes linger on the raw grooves carved into his wrists, her heart softened. Those wounds spoke of cruelty far deeper than any harm he might have chosen. She thought of her husband's fever, the helpless hours by his bedside, how she had prayed and bargained with God, only to watch life slip away. That same helplessness had risen again today as she saw Samuel in chains, but this time she had acted, this time she had reached out, and that choice, reckless or not, felt like a spark of healing in the hollow spaces grief had left behind. The town dwindled behind them, its rooftops melting into the haze of dust. Ahead, the road curved toward the river, where cottonwoods shimmered with pale green leaves. The sound of water welcomed them, soft and soothing, like a hymn whispered against the silence. Clara slowed, guiding the borrowed mare to the creek, and Samuel followed. When he knelt by the water's edge, he cupped the stream in his hands with reverence, lifting it to his lips as though greeting an old friend. Clara watched, startled by the quiet beauty of the gesture, the way the sunlight caught on droplets running down his fingers. It felt sacred somehow, healing in its simplicity. She found herself breathing more easily, as if the water's calm had reached into her own chest. When his eyes lifted to hers, she held his gaze, unflinching. They did not need many words. The look they shared was enough. It said, "I see you, and I am not afraid." And perhaps that was more binding than any spoken vow. They continued on, the path narrowing as the hills rose to greet them. Clara felt the ache of weariness in her bones, the familiar weight of responsibility pressing down, the ranch leaning closer each day toward ruin, the debts that whispered of foreclosure, the fences that sagged, the garden that refused to thrive. Yet for the first time in years, she did not carry that burden alone. The stranger, Samuel Tallbear, though she did not yet know his name, moved with her step by step, his presence steady as the ground beneath her boots. The ranch appeared in the fading light, worn and weary like its mistress. Fences broken, the barn patched and fragile, the fields thirsty and thin. Clara felt the sting of shame rise, heat blooming in her cheeks. She wanted to explain, to tell him that it had once been full of promise, that once there had been cattle and laughter and hope. But before she could speak, she saw him surveying the place with calm eyes. No judgment, no pity, only the quiet calculation of a man who had seen worse, and who still believed in survival. That look was healing in its own way, easing the sharp edge of her pride. She dismounted with care, leading the mare into the barn. Without being asked, he moved to help, his large hands steady as he lifted the saddle and set it down with unexpected gentleness. Inside the house, she lit the lamp, its glow softening the corners of the sparse room. She offered him the barn for rest, blankets and hay to soften the night. She spoke with practiced composure, yet when she turned, she found him staring at the photograph of Jacob, her late husband, smiling forever from the frame. "My husband," she murmured, her voice faltering. "Jacob." Samuel's eyes lingered, dark and thoughtful, and he gave a slow nod of respect. He did not speak, but something in that silence felt heavier, deeper than words could have offered. As he turned to leave for the barn, he paused in the doorway, his lips shaping careful syllables as if remembering how to form them. "Thank you." The words, rough and low, struck her with the weight of a promise. Clara pressed her hand against her heart, steadying its wild rhythm, knowing in that instant that the path ahead would not be easy. Yet she felt the faintest stirrings of something long forgotten. Hope, fragile but alive. That night she lay in her narrow bed, listening to the old house sigh against the wind. Yet underneath those familiar creaks was something new, the awareness that she was not alone. For the first time in 3 years, since Jacob's death had left her in silence, another presence breathed beneath her roof. It should have frightened her, as the town expected. Instead, it was like the touch of balm on an old wound, a healing warmth that wrapped around her in the dark. She closed her eyes and let it carry her into uneasy but strangely comforting dreams. The dawn broke soft and golden, spilling across the worn boards of her kitchen floor. When she opened the door, Samuel was already awake, standing by the barn with tools in hand. He gestured toward the fence, then to himself, and finally toward her house, as if to ask permission. Clara understood. Her voice wavered, but she answered, "If you wish. I cannot pay you, not beyond food and shelter." He lifted his hands, palms scarred from iron, and pointed to her, then to the ranch, then to himself. The message was clear. She had freed him, and that was payment enough. Something broke inside her then, but not with sorrow. It was as if a wall she had built to guard herself had cracked, letting in light. She felt her throat tighten, her eyes sting, but she managed a smile. "Then we'd best begin." The sound of hammer on wood soon echoed through the air, rhythmic and steady, blending with the cluck of hens and the soft breath of wind through the grass. Clara carried water, her steps slowing each time she neared to watch him work. His strength was evident, but so too was his care, each strike deliberate, each post set firm and true. She found herself remembering Jacob's words, that a man was only as good as the tools he worked with. When she repeated them aloud, Samuel lifted his head and nodded gravely, as though her husband's wisdom had bridged the distance between them. Evening fell with the scent of cornbread and beans drifting through the kitchen. She set a place for him at her table, her pulse quickening as he entered. They ate quietly, but not uncomfortably. The silence felt alive, filled with the soft murmur of healing, not only of land or fences, but of hearts. When she spoke of her struggles, her pride, her grief, he listened, his attention unbroken, as if each word mattered. And when he finally spoke, his voice low but certain, his words were like water running over stone. "Land remembers," he said, "waits for hands, waits for hearts." She swallowed hard, tears pricking her eyes, for in his simple truth she felt not only the story of her ranch, but of her own soul, waiting for care, waiting for renewal. Outside, the night deepened, and the stars burned bright. Clara watched them from her window as Samuel lit the lantern in the barn. For the first time in years, the silence of the valley did not feel empty. It felt like promise. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to imagine. And though danger loomed, neighbors with sharp tongues, men with cruel intentions, Clara felt the fragile seed of purpose take root. Perhaps together they could withstand the storm. Perhaps together they could heal. The next days would test them, with whispers turning to threats, with shadows gathering at the edges of their fragile peace. But tonight the sound of the hammer still lingered in the air, like a heartbeat steady and sure. And in that rhythm, Clara knew she was no longer alone. The morning had barely shaken the mist from the hills when Clara noticed the sound that had been absent for so long, the steady rhythm of work breathing life back into the ranch. The hammer's echo rang out across the fields, crisp against the hush of dawn, as Samuel's figure moved with purpose along the leaning fences. Each swing was sure, each nail driven with the confidence of a man who knew wood, knew earth, knew the language of labor. Clara stood on the porch with a steaming cup in her hands, watching him, her heart pulling in ways she could not name. The ranch had been a place of decay for years, the weight of grief pressing it down. Yet now every stroke of his hammer sounded like a heartbeat, steady, healing, unyielding. She carried his coffee to him, the early sun laying gold upon the earth. When he paused, wiping sweat from his brow, she offered it silently. He took the tin cup with a nod, their fingers brushing briefly. That faint touch was enough to send warmth spiraling through her chest, a whisper of life where only emptiness had dwelled. Together, they stood for a moment in quiet ease, watching the light spread across the valley. The days began to shape themselves around this rhythm. Samuel's strength turned broken fences upright, patched sagging barn doors, coaxed the well pump back into service. Clara tended the garden, the hens, the small duties of survival, but her eyes often strayed toward him. There was poetry in the way he worked, not of careless force, but of measured care. He did not rush, he did not waste. Even the barn cats sensed it, winding around his legs without fear, purring under the gentleness of his hand. One evening, when the last light lingered on the horizon, Clara carried supper out to the barn. She found him bent over a broken harness, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy as he threaded leather through a buckle. The sight made her throat ache, for it was such a simple human thing. This man, whom others had chained and spat upon, patiently mending a tool to make it whole again. She set the tray beside him, whispering, "You don't have to." He lifted his eyes, a glimmer of amusement there, and returned to his task without reply. It was answer enough. They ate together, the barn cat slipping from shadows to curl near his feet. Clara watched as one bold tabby pressed against his leg, and he reached down to stroke its head, his touch light and reverent. In that moment, the walls she had built around her heart cracked wider. She had bought his freedom, but it was she who felt rescued from silence, from despair, from the belief that nothing could bloom again in barren soil. Night settled gently over the ranch, and Clara lay awake in her bed, listening. The creaks of the old house were familiar, yet layered beneath them was something new, the awareness of another presence nearby. It should have unsettled her. Instead, it comforted, like a quilt laid soft over weary shoulders. She turned her face toward the window where a faint glow shone from the barn lantern. For the first time in 3 years, she felt the sweet ache of possibility. Morning brought with it necessity. Clara, pencil in hand, tried to list what needed repair. Roof, well, chicken coop, garden fence. But every line she wrote only deepened the truth. The ranch was collapsing under the weight of years. Her purse was empty, her strength nearly so. When a knock came at the door, she expected trouble. But when she opened it, Samuel stood there, pointing toward the barn, then at himself, then miming the swing of a hammer. "You want to work?" she asked. He nodded. "I cannot pay you," she whispered, heat rising to her cheeks. "Food and shelter, that is all." He raised his scarred hands, still bearing the marks of iron, and gestured toward her, the house, the land, then back to himself. The meaning was plain. Freedom was enough. She felt tears sting, but she blinked them back. Then we'd better begin." By midday, the sharp ring of steel on wood filled the air, and the sagging fences began to rise strong and true. Clara brought him water, and when he paused, he surprised her with words. "Good tools," he said, nodding toward the shed. His voice was low, rough, yet sure. Clara found her breath catch at the sound and managed, "My husband, Jacob, was particular. He said a man was only as good as his tools." Samuel considered, then nodded with solemn approval. "Wise." That night, as they sat at the table, Clara spoke of Jacob, of their dream to raise horses, of the slow decline that had left her clinging to ashes. She spoke of letters from her family urging her to sell, of neighbors who crossed the street rather than face her grief. He listened in silence, but never looked away. When her voice faltered, he turned to the window, his silhouette dark against the fading light. After a long pause, he said, "Land remembers, waits for hands, waits for hearts." Clara's throat tightened. His words were simple, but they fell like balm over wounds she had thought too deep to heal. She reached across the table, not thinking, just feeling, and her hand brushed his. He did not pull away. The days unfolded into weeks, marked by small miracles. The well pump flowed with clear water. The fence line stood tall again. The garden, once strangled by weeds, showed tender green shoots. Each improvement carried the weight of renewal, not just of land, but of spirit. At night they shared the porch, watching stars kindle above. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes not, but the silence was never empty. It was full of healing, of trust being born. She learned his name the day the well ran again. Water gushed clear into the bucket, and he smiled, a real, unguarded smile that transformed his face. He placed a hand to his chest and said, "Samuel, Samuel Tallbear." She repeated it softly, savoring the sound. He smiled wider at the kindness in her voice. But Dry Creek was not blind. Each time Clara rode into town for supplies, whispers curled like smoke. Women crossed the street. Conversations fell silent. Only young Tom Bradley met her eyes, slipping an extra apple into her basket when no one watched. "They're saying things," he warned one day. "Ugly things about you and him." Clara lifted her chin, refusing shame. "Let them. I know the truth." Yet inside, her heart trembled, for truth alone does not always protect against hatred. That night, when she returned home, she found Samuel repairing the barn door, the last light of dusk painting his profile in gold. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment their eyes held, the weight of the world pressing down around them. She felt it then, that whatever storms the town brewed, they would face them together. And though the night air whispered of danger, of men gathering in shadows, Clara carried something stronger back into the house. The warmth of his presence, the steadiness of his hands, the healing rhythm of shared labor. For the first time in years, the ranch did not feel like a place of endings. It felt like the fragile beginning of something new, something worth protecting, worth daring, worth loving. If this story has warmed you, if it stirred even a breath of healing in your heart, linger with it a while. Let it remind you that broken fences can stand again, that even hearts left barren by grief can bloom when touched by kindness. If you feel that spark, I invite you gently, like, comment, and subscribe, so that together we may walk further along this trail of hope and love. The fences were rising, the land breathing, and with every nail Samuel drove into weathered wood, Clara felt the same renewal driving itself quietly into her soul. She looked at him across the lamplight that night, his face softened by shadow, and thought, perhaps the ranch isn't the only thing worth saving. The first time Clara saw the scars on his back, it was not by intention, but by accident. The summer sun pressed hard upon the ranch that day, and Samuel had stripped off his shirt to work by the well. She had come out carrying water, her voice ready to call his name, but the sight froze her steps. His skin, bronzed by labor and weather, was a canvas of old wounds, slashes, burns, and the raw map of cruelty carved deep by hands that had sought to break him. The scars ran like rivers, each one telling a story of survival, each one speaking of pain too great for words. Clara's breath caught, not from fear, but from a sorrow that pierced her chest. For years she had believed her grief was immeasurable, yet here stood a man whose very body was a testament to endurance against the world's mercilessness. Samuel turned slightly, noticing her gaze, and for a moment she thought he would cover himself. Instead, he held her eyes, unashamed, as though daring her to look away. But she did not. She stepped closer, gently offering the cup of water. Their fingers brushed, and though neither spoke, the silence between them grew dense with understanding. Healing often begins in unspoken places, in the courage to look at another's wounds without flinching. That evening, when the sun slid down behind the hills, Clara found herself telling him of Jacob. Her voice shook as she spoke of the fever that had taken her husband in just 3 days, how helpless she had felt, how she had prayed until her throat was raw and still watched him slip away. "I could not save him," she whispered. The words spilled like confession, raw and aching. Samuel listened, silent as always, but when she dared to meet his eyes, she found no pity there, only the weight of someone who understood loss. Later, by the fading glow of the fire, he spoke for the first time of his family. His words came slowly, broken by pauses, but each one struck deep. He told her of his father, strong elk, protector of their people, fierce and gentle. He spoke of his mother, Singing River, whose voice could make warriors weep. He spoke of a sister, Little Fawn, only 14 summers when the soldiers came. His village had burned in the dawn, and when he returned from hunting, all he found was smoke and silence. His voice trembled, but he did not cry. The grief lived so deep within him, it had become part of his marrow. Clara reached out, her hand covering his where it rested on his knee. It was a simple gesture, but his fingers turned and clasped hers tightly, as though anchoring himself in her presence. She had not expected him to allow such closeness, but in that shared silence, 2 wounded souls found recognition. Grief had carved them both hollow, but perhaps in the meeting of those wounds, something new could grow. In the days that followed, their bond deepened in subtle ways. When Clara worked in the garden, Samuel would bring water without being asked. When Samuel lifted heavy beams for the barn, Clara would steady the ladder with her small but unwavering hands. They began to speak more, his English halting, her patience endless. She taught him words from her books, and he taught her sounds from his own tongue: water, sky, earth. She laughed at her clumsy pronunciation, and he smiled, the kind of smile that softened the hard planes of his face. The sound of laughter had been absent from her home for so long that when it returned, it felt like sunlight spilling into a darkened room. One evening, Clara heard him singing. The voice rose from the barn, low and haunting, a melody unlike any she had ever known. She stood in the doorway, her heart stilled by the sound. When he noticed her listening, he grew quiet, almost embarrassed. "Song for horses," he murmured. "My grandfather's song. Make them calm." She stepped closer, her eyes shining. "It was beautiful. Will you teach me?" His surprise was visible, but he nodded. And so, beneath the wide sky, Samuel taught her the words of his people, his voice patient, her laughter soft when she stumbled. Healing happens in song, too, in the courage to share language, to share memory, to share what once was forbidden. As summer deepened, the ranch began to change. The fences stood firm, the garden bloomed, and even the hens grew fatter, as though sensing the shift in the air. Neighbors whispered crueler words, but Clara's steps grew steadier. Each night, when she glanced toward the barn and saw the glow of his lantern, she felt less alone. Each morning, when she carried 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, she felt her heart swell with a warmth she had thought buried forever. Yet not all eyes in Dry Creek were blind. Morrison and the Harmon brothers rode by often, their gazes sharp with judgment. Rumors spread of the widow and her savage, whispers thick as smoke. One night, riders came with torches, Reverend Blackwood at their head, spitting words of sin and shame. But Clara stood on her porch with Jacob's shotgun in her hands, Samuel at her side, silent and unyielding. "The only shame here," she told them, her voice steady, "is treating a man as less than human." They rode away, but their threats lingered like storm clouds. Later, as dawn broke after that long night, Clara turned to Samuel. Her voice softened, fragile with the weight of everything unsaid. "They will never forgive me for bringing you here." He looked at her then, his dark eyes steady. "Not forgive, not forget. But you see, man. This enough." She felt tears spill unbidden, and he lifted his hand, rough with work, to brush them gently away. The touch was brief, but it carried more healing than words ever could. And so their nights grew longer, their conversations deeper. They spoke of dreams and ghosts, of the ache of memory and the tender hope of tomorrow. Clara confessed that she dreamed of Jacob often, waking with the pain of losing him anew. Samuel admitted that his family visited him in sleep, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with fire. "Grief is like river," he said softly, "sometimes quiet, sometimes raging, but always flowing." Clara rested her head against his shoulder, whispering, "Then perhaps we learn to swim together." In that moment, under the quiet canopy of stars, she realized that the emptiness within her chest was no longer hollow. It was filling slowly, tenderly, with something alive, something she dared not name but could no longer deny. And if your heart, listening to this, feels even a small spark of warmth, let it rest with you tonight. Healing can arrive in silence, in touch, in the courage to see another's pain and not look away. If these words bring comfort, if they stir something gentle within you, I invite you kindly. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, subscribe, and let us continue walking together through stories that remind us love and hope can bloom even in the dust. The scars of the past remained on his skin, in her memory, in the whispers of the town. Yet together they began to weave those scars into something new, a fabric strong enough to hold them both. And though storms gathered on the horizon, Clara knew, as she looked at Samuel across the fading firelight, that whatever came, they would stand, not as widow and outcast, but as two souls choosing at last to live. The first sign of trouble was the sound of hooves. Clara had been in the garden, the late afternoon sun spilling golden light across rows of beans and carrots when the faint rumble reached her ears. She froze, hand tightening around the wooden handle of her hoe, her heart quickening as the noise grew louder. Horses. More than one. The ground itself seemed to tremble with the approach, carrying with it a weight of menace she had been dreading. Samuel appeared at the edge of the barn before she even turned her head. His movements were calm, but there was a watchfulness in his eyes, the kind of stillness that spoke of storms weathered before. He carried only a hammer at his belt, yet when he stepped closer to her side, Clara felt a strange steadiness rise within her, as though his presence alone was a shield. The riders came into view, 4 men cresting the hill with the swagger of those who believed they owned the land beneath their boots. Dale Morrison rode at the front, his hat casting a shadow over his cold eyes, flanked by the Harmon brothers, drunkards with tempers as quick as their pistols, and Sheriff McKenna, who looked uneasy even as he pulled his horse to a halt at Clara's gate. "Mrs. Whitford?" Morrison called, his voice smooth as oil yet sharp beneath the surface. "We've come to check on your welfare." Clara straightened slowly, dust clinging to her skirts, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. "As you can see, Mr. Morrison, I am perfectly well." Morrison dismounted, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol, as though it were an extension of himself. "You can't blame folks for being concerned. A woman alone with a savage." Clara's jaw tightened. Before she could speak, Samuel stepped forward, silent, his figure tall and steady just behind her shoulder. The afternoon light caught the hammer at his side, and though he did not lift it, the gesture was enough to make the Harmon brothers shift uneasily in their saddles. "His name is Samuel," Clara said sharply, her voice cutting like glass. "And I am not alone." Morrison's smile faltered. "You've taken leave of your senses, but I'm prepared to help. I'll take that creature off your hands, and I'll make you a fair offer for this land." "You could go back east, start fresh." "My land is not for sale," Clara replied, her voice low and dangerous. "Everything's for sale," Morrison pressed, stepping closer. "It's just a matter of price." "Get off my property." The words fell from her lips like iron, steady and unshakable. The Harmon brothers shifted again, their hands hovering near their weapons. McKenna cleared his throat, uneasy. "The ladies asked you to leave, Morrison. I suggest you do it." The tension hung thick, the air heavy with the weight of violence waiting to erupt. Samuel did not move, did not speak, but his presence alone was enough to tip the balance. He stood slightly behind Clara, watchful, ready, his silence louder than any threat. Morrison's face darkened, anger burning in his eyes, but after a long pause, he turned back to his horse. "This isn't over," he muttered. "When that savage shows his true nature, don't expect help from decent folk." Clara did not flinch. "The only indecency here is in your threats." They rode away in a cloud of dust, but the echo of their words lingered long after. Clara felt her knees weaken, and she might have collapsed if Samuel hadn't steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow. His touch was firm, grounding, and she turned to him, whispering, "Thank you." He shook his head slowly. "You stand for me," he said simply. "I stand for you." That night, Clara could not bring herself to send him back to the barn. "There's a room off the kitchen," she said hesitantly, her cheeks warming. "It was meant for... well, it's empty now. You'd be closer, if trouble came." Samuel's eyes softened, understanding without words. That night, for the first time since Jacob's death, Clara slept with the comfort of another soul beneath her roof, a protector who had chosen to stay. But the shadows of Dry Creek were restless. Word spread fast, rumors growing sharper, threats carried on whispers. Reverend Blackwood thundered from the pulpit about sin and abomination, and Morrison fanned the flames with talk of danger, of purity, of fear. Clara felt the weight of it pressing down, yet each day she rose with purpose. She tended her land, worked beside Samuel, and little by little life crept back into the bones of the ranch. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of violet and rose, Clara carried supper outside. They sat together under the cottonwood tree, the air rich with the scent of stew and fresh bread. She asked Samuel about his family, and he spoke with a voice both steady and broken, of his father's strength, his mother's laughter, the little sister whose life had been stolen by fire and violence. His words carved pictures in the air, vivid and raw, and Clara's hand found his across the table, her fingers threading through his as though to anchor him against the tide of memory. In return, she told him of Jacob, not only of his death, but of his life. How he had courted her with quiet humor, how he had dreamed of horses running free across their land, how his laughter had once filled this ranch with light. Her voice cracked, but Samuel listened with the patience of one who knew grief intimately, and when her tears fell, he did not look away. "Strength," he said softly, "to love so deeply, even through pain." The bond between them grew, not in sudden declarations, but in the slow, healing work of trust. Their hands brushed while mending fence posts. Their shoulders touched as they carried water from the well. At night, the porch became their sanctuary, where silence wrapped around them like a blanket, and the stars bore witness to a closeness that words could not yet name. But the storm was not done gathering. Riders came in the night, 6 men with torches, their voices sharp with accusation. Blackwood called it sin, Hutchkins muttered threats, and the Harmon brothers spat insults, daring Samuel to act. Clara stood on the porch, shotgun in hand, Samuel steady at her side. "The only shame here," she told them, her voice ringing clear, "is riding to a woman's home in darkness with hate in your hearts." They left, but not before a torch was thrown toward the barn. Samuel stamped it out before it caught, his movements swift and sure. The smell of smoke lingered long after, a reminder of how close destruction always rode. As dawn rose, pale and trembling, Clara turned to him. "They will not stop," she whispered, "and you should not have to bear this." He looked at her, his eyes deep as the earth itself. "I choose this. I choose to stay. Not for shelter, not for food, for you." Her breath caught, her heart pounding with a rhythm she had thought buried with Jacob. She did not answer with words, only with the trembling of her hand as she reached for his. His fingers closed gently around hers, and in that touch was a vow stronger than any spoken promise. If this story has touched your heart, if it has stirred even a flicker of warmth or healing inside you, I invite you, pause with it a moment. Let it remind you that even in the face of hate, Love can root itself deep and strong. If you feel that truth, share your thoughts, leave a comment, and subscribe, so we can keep walking this path of light together. The road ahead would not be easy. Morrison would return, the town would not forgive, and shadows would rise again. Yet as Clara looked into Samuel's steady eyes, she knew they would face it side by side, not as outcast and widow, but as two souls daring to choose hope over fear. The morning began with the sound of a hawk wheeling overhead, its cry sharp against the endless sky. Clara shaded her eyes, watching it drift on unseen currents, free and fearless. Below, Samuel was already at work, splitting wood with clean, powerful strokes. The rhythm of his labor carried through the air like a steady heartbeat, grounding her in a way she hadn't known she needed. She brought him water, steam rising from the tin cup in the cool dawn, and for a moment their hands lingered as she passed it to him. He met her gaze, and though neither spoke, warmth passed between them, subtle as sunlight breaking frost. But peace never held long in Dry Creek. By midday, the warning came. Young Tom Bradley rode hard into the yard, dust trailing like smoke behind him. He slid from his horse, his voice urgent. "They're stirring up trouble in town. Morrison's been riling men again. They say they'll come here, tonight or tomorrow, to drive him out. Or worse." His eyes darted to Samuel, then back to Clara, wide with worry. "Please be careful." Clara thanked him with steady composure, though inside her heart rattled against her ribs. After Tom left, silence hung heavy between her and Samuel. He didn't ask what had been said. He already knew. Instead, he laid down the axe and crossed the yard toward her, his presence calm but unyielding. "Storm comes," he said simply. She nodded, her breath trembling. They prepared quietly. Clara checked Jacob's shotgun, cleaning it with careful hands, while Samuel inspected the Colt revolver she had pressed into his keeping days before. The sight of him handling it with reverence, his movements slow and respectful, made her feel both safer and more afraid. Safer because he would protect her, afraid because she might lose him in the fight that brewed. That evening, she insisted he eat inside. They shared cornbread and beans at her small table, lamplight softening the lines of their faces. Conversation was sparse, but the silence was no longer empty. It was weighted with unspoken vows. Once, Clara's grief had filled every corner of her house. Now his presence steadied it, transforming loneliness into a fragile but growing sense of companionship. When darkness fell, torches appeared at the edge of the horizon. Clara saw them first from the porch, her chest tightening as the flames wavered closer, carried by riders who did not come with peace. Samuel stood behind her, his shadow tall against the lamplight, his silence stronger than any words. Together they waited. 6 riders entered the yard, their voices harsh in the night air. Reverend Blackwood's tone carried false righteousness, laced with venom. "Mrs. Whitford, you shame yourself and this town. Cast him out, or we will." Morrison was absent, but his venom was there in every sneer, every threat. The Harmon brothers jeered, spitting words that cut sharper than blades. Clara raised the shotgun, her arms steady though her heart hammered. "You ride to a woman's home in the dark like cowards," she said, her voice ringing through the yard. "I have broken no law. I will not bow to your hate." Samuel stepped forward then, and though he said nothing, his presence radiated strength. The men shifted uneasily under his gaze, their bravado faltering. Blackwood, desperate to reclaim control, pointed a torch toward the barn. One of the Harmon brothers hurled it, flames licking as it struck dry earth. In a heartbeat, Samuel moved, stamping it out with swift precision, the fire smothered before it could claim wood. The act silenced the yard, his defiance clear without a single word spoken. "Enough," Clara said, her voice cutting like steel. "Leave my land." They spat more threats, promised vengeance, but one by one they turned, their torches dwindling into the night. The echo of their hooves lingered long after, heavy as thunder retreating across the plains. Clara's knees weakened, and she might have fallen if Samuel hadn't caught her elbow, steadying her with a touch both strong and tender. Inside, she set aside the shotgun with trembling hands. Samuel spoke then, low and certain. "You are brave." She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I am terrified." His gaze softened. "Bravery is not without fear. Bravery is standing still, even with fear." She looked at him, the lamplight glinting in his dark eyes, and felt something shift deep inside her. For years she had lived with emptiness, a widow clinging to shadows. Now, beside this man, her heart beat with purpose again. She whispered, "They will never forgive me for standing with you." His reply was simple, but it sank into her soul like healing rain. "Not need all forgive, need only truth. You see me as man. This enough." That night she could not bring herself to retreat to her lonely bed. Instead, they sat together on the porch, the cool air wrapping around them as stars bloomed overhead. She spoke of Jacob again, but this time her words carried not only grief, but fondness, the sweetness of memory, rather than only the bitterness of loss. Samuel listened, then shared more of his past, the songs his mother had sung, the lessons of his father, the sister who had once braided flowers into his hair. Their voices wove threads of sorrow and remembrance, and in the weaving, something new was born. Trust, tender and fierce. When at last she leaned her head against his shoulder, the gesture felt both daring and natural. His body stilled, then relaxed, as though he too had been waiting for this closeness. Together they sat in silence, watching the night stretch wide around them, two wounded souls daring to rest in each other's presence. If your heart feels a flicker of warmth here, if these moments soothe some quiet ache within you, let them linger. Healing does not always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it is found in sitting shoulder to shoulder under a sky full of stars, daring to believe in tomorrow. If you wish to walk further with these souls, I invite you gently, like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment with what stirred you, so we may continue this journey of love, hope, and renewal together. The night wore on, but Clara did not fear the shadows anymore. Samuel was beside her, and in his steady silence she felt the promise of safety. Beyond the horizon, Morrison still schemed, the town still whispered. But here on her porch, under the quiet gaze of the stars, she knew they had already chosen to stand together, whatever storms might come. Smoke rose against the bright afternoon sky, a dark column twisting above the valley, visible even from the Whitford ranch. Clara dropped the basket of eggs in her hands, the shells breaking against the earth, her breath catching in alarm. Samuel, who had been repairing the chicken coop, had already lifted his head, eyes narrowing toward the distant plume. No words were needed. They both began to run. The source became clear as they crested the ridge. The Garrett farm, neighbors to the east, was engulfed in flames. The barn roared like a beast, its roof sagging, sparks raining into the summer air. Clara's heart clenched when she heard Martha Garrett's voice carrying across the chaos, broken with terror. "Emma's still inside. She was playing in the loft." Men tried to hold Paul Garrett back as he struggled violently, desperate to charge into the fire, but the flames were already devouring the structure. Doc Bradley shouted warnings. Tom Bradley hauled buckets of water. Neighbors formed a frantic line, but the blaze was too fierce. The crowd pulsed with dread, fear rooting their feet to the ground. Samuel did not hesitate. Without a word, he ran full force into the inferno. Clara's throat locked in terror, her scream caught beneath the weight of her fear. She saw him vanish into the thick smoke, the flames swallowing his figure. For endless moments the world stopped. She clutched the fence post until splinters bit into her palm, her heart beating louder than the crackle of fire. Then, like a vision carved from smoke and flame, he emerged. His face was blackened with soot, his shirt scorched, but in his arms he carried the small, coughing form of Emma Garrett. He ran with the strength of desperation, shielding the child against his chest until he reached Martha, who fell to her knees, sobbing, clutching her daughter as though she'd been reborn. "She breathes," Samuel rasped, his voice raw but steady. "Scared, but safe." A stunned silence gripped the crowd, broken only by Emma's coughing. Martha rained kisses on her daughter's head, tears streaking through the soot on her cheeks. Paul Garrett staggered forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. Only days ago he had spoken words poisoned by prejudice, yet now he stood trembling, staring at the man who had saved his child. His voice cracked as he said, I was wrong about you." Samuel gave only a nod, turning back toward the fire, asking about animals, about what else might be saved. Without waiting, he joined the bucket line, his burned arms working tirelessly, passing water, shouting instructions. For the first time, the others followed his lead without hesitation. Men who had cursed him now stood shoulder to shoulder, taking orders from the man they had once spat at. By nightfall, the barn collapsed, sparks showering into the dirt. The house was spared, and the livestock mostly saved, though exhaustion clung to every soul gathered. Samuel stood apart, his chest heaving with the effort, his face still smeared with soot. Clara approached, her hands trembling as she touched his arm. Beneath her palm, his skin was hot, marked by burns, yet he gave her a small nod, as if to say he was whole. She wanted to cry with relief, but the pride that swelled in her chest kept the tears at bay. The sheriff cleared his throat awkwardly. "That was a brave thing you did," McKenna muttered, his eyes unwilling to meet Samuel's, but his tone softened with respect. Not many men would have run into that fire. And then, from the innocence of a child, came the words that cracked the last wall of hate. Emma, nestled against her mother, pointed toward Samuel and whispered, "The nice man saved me. He came through the fire like an angel." The crowd rippled with unease, then something softer. Neighbors exchanged glances, some ashamed, others thoughtful. Martha Garrett, still clutching her child, stood and faced Samuel, Her voice was firm, carrying through the night. "You saved my baby. You'll always have a place at our table." Then, in front of everyone, she rose on her toes and pressed a kiss against his cheek, leaving a clean mark in the soot. The gasp from the crowd was sharp, but no one spoke against it. Paul Garrett extended his hand, rough and calloused, his eyes wet with unspilled tears. "I owe you more than I can ever repay. Neighbors help neighbors. You've shown me what that truly means." Samuel clasped his hand firmly, his reply simple. "No debt, just life." It was then the tide began to turn. The whispers were different now, not sharp with condemnation, but edged with reluctant admiration. Old grudges loosened. Even Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, who had hissed Clara's name with disgust, looked at Samuel with conflicted eyes, her voice faltering as she muttered, "What he did was heroic." That night, as Clara and Samuel walked back toward their ranch, silence stretched between them, but it was not empty. She carried the image of him in the flames, risking his life without hesitation, and her heart ached with the weight of what might have been lost. When they reached the porch, she turned, her voice breaking. "I thought I'd lose you today." He looked at her steadily, the moonlight softening the soot still clinging to his skin. "I am here," he said simply. She touched his hand, her fingers trembling. "You could have died." He shook his head slowly. "You would have gone in. I know this. Same heart, same courage." The tears came then, silent but unstoppable. He caught her hand in his, holding it with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Not gone," he whispered. "Not leaving. I stay." Later, as he sat at her kitchen table, Clara tended his burns, her touch tender as she cleaned and wrapped them. He winced only once, watching her with quiet intensity. Her hands shook, but she did not falter, whispering words of care, as though each one might soothe away pain. In the flickering lamplight, the air between them thickened with something deeper than gratitude. It was trust, it was longing, it was the unspoken truth of two lives slowly intertwining. When she looked up, his eyes caught hers, and the room seemed to still. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat, the hush of healing settling over them. For so long she had lived with absence. Now presence filled every corner of her chest. She whispered, almost too soft to hear, "We saved each other." Outside, the night held its breath. If you feel the warmth of this moment, if it has soothed some quiet ache in you, let it linger. Healing stories remind us that courage and love can grow even where ashes lie. If this touched you, I invite you kindly, leave a comment, share your heart, and subscribe so we can walk together in this journey of light and renewal. The world beyond the ranch was still hostile, Morrison's schemes still brewing in shadows. But tonight, Clara knew the truth. The town had seen Samuel for who he was, and she had too. And in that knowing, in the fragile thread of trust and tenderness that bound them, hope took root. Tomorrow would bring its storms, but they would stand together, not as widow and stranger, but as two souls beginning to learn what love might dare to mean. The barn raising at the Garrett farm drew the whole valley together. Wagons creaked along the dusty road at sunrise, loaded with lumber, tools, and baskets of food. Clara guided her team slowly, Samuel beside her, his quiet strength radiating calm. As they crested the final hill, the sight opened before them. Neighbors gathering, men stacking beams, women spreading cloths for tables, children darting like swallows between the horses. For years, Clara had felt the sting of isolation, the sideways glances and whispered judgments. But that morning she felt something shift in the air. People were watching Samuel not with fear, but with a new, cautious respect. Paul Garrett was the first to stride forward, his voice carrying as he extended his hand toward Samuel. "Glad you're here. We'll need your strength on the main beams." The words were loud enough for others to hear, and the weight behind them was unmistakable. Samuel clasped his hand, a quiet nod sealing the gesture. Clara felt a flutter in her chest, seeing how quickly the walls of hate could begin to crack when courage had been witnessed. Work began in earnest, the rising frame of the barn lifting against the sky. Samuel moved among them with steady authority, guiding men twice his age, teaching young Tom Bradley how to brace beams with precision, catching timbers that threatened to slip. His voice carried calm, his hands sure, and slowly the others followed without hesitation. Where once there had been only suspicion, now there was trust. Clara worked alongside the women, but her eyes strayed often to him, her heart swelling at the sight of a man once chained now standing free at the center of labor and respect. By midday, the barn's skeleton stood tall, sunlight pouring through its beams. The tables groaned with food, laughter spilled across the yard, and for the first time Clara heard neighbors speak Samuel's name without venom. Even Sheriff McKenna, leaning against a post, muttered a grudging compliment. "Knows his craft, that one." And the others nodded, no one daring to contradict. When the last beam was lifted into place and the crowd gathered to admire their work, Paul Garrett climbed onto a platform, raising his voice. "Friends, neighbors, we've done more than raise a barn today. We've raised each other. And I'll say this plain. I was wrong to judge Samuel Tallbear by anything but his deeds. He saved my daughter, and today he worked harder than 3 men to build this. He's a neighbor, and I'm proud to call him friend." The cheer that followed was rough but genuine, echoing across the valley. Cups were raised, hands clapped on Samuel's shoulders, and though not every face was welcoming, many were. For the first time, Clara felt a thread of hope binding her to the community she had thought lost forever. She glanced at Samuel, who stood a little apart, humility etched into the quiet lines of his face. She slipped her hand into his, and his fingers curled gently around hers. That evening, back at the ranch, the air was soft with twilight, the scent of sage drifting through the windows. Clara set the table with her best dishes, the ones she hadn't touched since Jacob's death, and served supper by candlelight. Samuel looked at her, surprise flickering in his dark eyes. "Celebration?" he asked softly. "Yes," she whispered, "for today, for all we've built, for what we've begun." They ate slowly, conversation light but rich with meaning. Afterward, Samuel reached into his pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it he drew an arrowhead, white stone smoothed by time and care. "My mother made this," he said, his voice hushed with reverence. "For protection, for connection. I want you to have it." Clara took it with trembling hands, the weight of his gift heavier than gold. "Samuel, this is precious." He met her eyes, steady and certain. As are you." The air between them quivered with unspoken truth. Clara rose on her toes and pressed her lips gently to his, a kiss soft as a promise. When she drew back, his eyes were wide with wonder, his breath unsteady. "Clara," he whispered, her name carrying the weight of devotion. That night, for the first time in years, Clara lay down not with grief as her companion, but with hope blossoming in her chest. Samuel kept his quiet vigil on the porch, the arrowhead warm in her palm, and she knew the ranch was no longer a place of sorrow. It was a place of healing, of renewal, of love daring to root itself against all odds. Days passed into weeks, and the ranch bloomed under their care. The garden thrived, fences stood tall, animals grew fat and healthy. Laughter returned to the kitchen, soft songs drifted from the barn. Clara and Samuel worked side by side, their lives intertwined with a rhythm as natural as the rising sun. They were no longer widow and outcast, but partners, their bond forged in shared labor, in quiet trust, in the fire of trials endured. And though Morrison's shadow lingered on the horizon, though whispers never fully died, the valley had changed. Neighbors who once turned their backs now tipped their hats. Children waved when Samuel passed, and even Mrs. Patterson offered a tentative smile. Hatred had not vanished, but it no longer ruled. Love, courage, and healing had claimed their place. One evening, beneath a sky painted with stars, Clara leaned against Samuel on the porch. "For so long," she murmured, "I thought the ranch would bury me, but now it feels alive again." Samuel's arm wrapped gently around her shoulders. "Not just land," he said. "Hearts, too. From ashes, new life." She smiled, her eyes wet with joy. "Yes, new life." The night deepened. The lantern glowed softly, and the world beyond their porch seemed distant. What mattered was here. Two souls once broken, now whole together. If this story has given you even a breath of comfort, if it has stirred warmth in your heart, I invite you. Let it stay with you tonight. Let it remind you that healing can grow from ashes, that love can blossom even where grief once ruled. If these words touched you, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more, and let us walk together through stories that remind us of light, of hope, and of the love that makes us whole. The valley slept, the stars wheeled above, and on the quiet porch of the Whitford Ranch, love endured, quiet, steadfast, eternal